It's an age-old debate. Do you let your game meat soak in the icy water of your cooler or not? From my experience, some hunters swear by throwing their quarter deer into coolers loaded with ice and melted water, while others swear doing so will ruin the flavor and texture of the meat. They swear by keeping the meat off the ice at all costs. Which method is better? Today, we're getting to the bottom of this once and for all. This video is sponsored by Midway USA. They have just about everything you need for the outdoors and beyond. Check them out today at midwayusa.com. For this experiment, I took the backstrap of a whitetail buck that I killed here in Pennsylvania. I cut it in half and placed one half on a wire rack in the cooler and the other half in the same cooler but submerged in the ice and water. I left the meat in the cooler for 3.5 days, then trimmed each piece of meat completely, cooked it up, and ate it side by side. Now, I won't tell you which method tasted better just yet, but I will tell you there was a clear winner. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of the soaking on ice method. This method was created by hunters in warm weather climates who don't have the ability to cool down their meat effectively. When you're hunting in temperatures over 45 degrees, it is a race to cool that meat down as quickly as possible. Hunters realized that the quickest way to cool it down was to throw it in a cooler with ice and to keep it on that ice for 1 to 3 days. They say soaking meat in the ice water helps remove the blood, which in turn reduces the gamey taste and overall makes the meat taste better. They also say there's an added benefit of having a few days wiggle room between the time you shoot the deer and the time you need to have it all processed by. Now, critics of this method say it results in major flavor loss. I always see people talking about this. The critics argue that soaking the meat strips it of its natural flavor, resulting in bland and boring venison. They also say it can make the meat's texture soft and mushy. Then there's the obvious, the horrendous color change that occurs when you soak meat in water. It turns this ugly gray color that makes the meat look spoiled. You'll see lots of that later on in this video. And finally, the last critique of this method is bacterial growth. If the water temperature rises above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, bacteria can grow and you're at risk of making yourself sick. So what do I think? Well, I was always told that this method was wrong. It was implied that people who soaked their meat in water don't actually care about the meat and that it's the lazy way of doing things. It's like throw the meat in the cooler and forget about it for 3 days until you have to deal with it. So needless to say, I was never really interested in trying it because people talked so negatively about it. But I realized recently that I don't actually know whether this method is good or not because I've never tried it for myself. So here we are experimenting to figure it out for ourselves. So I'm taking this beautiful piece of backstrap. This is exactly as I took it off the deer, and I'm going to cut it straight down the middle. And since this experiment is like you just butchered your deer, you're throwing all the meat in the cooler, I'm leaving it just like this because that is exactly as I pulled it off the deer. This is how it would look in the cooler. There is a chance that you might take some of the fat off the back, but I think that's also gonna kind of protect some of the meat. So we're gonna leave it as is. Let's see. Then this is my setup here. I have my rack going in this aluminum pan. That'll give it some air circulation, and then it's gonna go in this bucket to help prevent the water from reaching it. So I will put this, we'll start meat side down, and then we have this guy, which will go in the cooler directly onto the ice. So here is our control for submerged. Fully submerged. This is our control for dry. So there's our nice dry controlled. And there's our bee floating in the water. Close this down. After 3.5 days, it's time to trim up this meat and see how it looks. While we trim, let's dive into the pros and cons of the dry on ice method. This method involves placing game meat in coolers without letting it touch the ice. Meat is placed on a barrier of some sort like a wire rack or a plastic bag, just anything that prevents the meat from actually touching the water or ice. The more air circulation around the meat, the better. Typically, hunters don't leave the meat in the cooler like this for too long, only a day or two until they're able to finish processing it completely. They say this method does a much better job at maintaining the flavor of the meat. You also avoid the gross color change that occurs with the soaking method, and the meat stays beautifully red and vibrant. Now, a downside of this method is you'll likely need more than one cooler for a single deer. You need that extra space for air circulation and keeping some space between each cut of meat. However, it's hard to find a critic of this method. At least from my perspective, I think it's pretty widely accepted as the proper way to handle meat when the temperatures are above 45 degrees and you don't have access to a walk-in cooler. This is how I've always handled my wild game meat. If I have access to a walk-in cooler, the meat's going in the walk-in cooler. If temps are below 45 outside, I'm hanging the deer whole and letting Mother Nature do its thing. But if temps are over 45 degrees, the meat's going into a cooler using this dry on ice method. Now take a look at the color of this ice-soaked backstrap. It's gray and disgusting. And from what I've been told and read online, lots of folks who do this method only trim away the fat in the silver skin, but they eat the discolored meat as they normally would eat a regular colored piece of meat. However, I will not do that. I'm not eating this disgusting discolored meat. I don't care if it's quote unquote just oxidation or whatever, I'm trimming it away. For one, it looks gross, and two, I'm concerned about bacteria growth from soaking it in the water. Again, this is my first time doing this and I'm trying to be safe. By removing that outer layer, I feel I'm better protecting myself from any possible contamination. And I'm viewing trimming away this discolored meat in a similar fashion to trimming meat that has been properly dry aged. When you dry age meat, it creates a hard crust on the outside that needs to be trimmed away. You gain a lot in flavor and texture, but the cost of that process is meat loss during the trimming process. I'm not sure yet if I'll gain anything in flavor or texture from this soaking method, but at this stage of the experiment, the extra meat loss from trimming is certainly added to the list of cons for the soaking method. I will say, after trimming, the once gross-looking backstrap is not looking so gross anymore. In fact, I can hardly tell a difference between these two cuts of meat. Maybe the soaked backstrap is a little bit lighter in color, but overall, they look very similar. To prep the meat for cooking, I sprinkled both with kosher salt and black pepper, then allowed them to sit on the counter for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I started to notice a difference. The ice-soaked backstrap was oozing more liquid than the dry on ice backstrap. I patted them both super dry with paper towels and seared them in a hot cast iron pan with oil. Both cuts looked amazing coming out of the pan. They both had a really great crusty sear on the outside, which I was sort of surprised. I wasn't sure if the ice-soaked backstrap would sear well because of all of the water, but to my surprise, it did. It seared up great, just the same as the dry on ice backstrap. I cooked the meat to an internal temperature of 130 degrees Fahrenheit and allowed it to rest for 10 minutes before cutting into it. Once cut in half, I noticed the ice-soaked cut of meat was much juicier than the dry on ice cut. It's clear as day. That's some points for the ice-soaked meat. But how does it taste? First up, the dry on ice meat. Now, as I was filming this, I assumed I was going to do a voiceover, so I wasn't speaking my reactions until a little later on, which is kind of funny, but I'll let you see how this all played out. Pretty good. Shut up. It's more tender. Oh my God. It's actually better. Oh my God. It's more pleasant, like immediately, right off the fork. It has a more mild flavor. And then after, there's no like spike of a gamey flavor at the end. Whereas I feel like with the air dried one, it's slightly more gamey upon first bite, not as tender. And then what I'm finding, besides the tenderness is really big. Hold on, let me cut. Oh. Let me see, let me try again. It's gamier. The air dried one is gamier. Not as tender. The tenderness could potentially also be just where in the backstrap this was cut. It's significantly better. I'm actually so shocked. The results are in and they're crystal clear. The water-soaked backstrap tastes better than the air-dried backstrap. The only thing I don't like about the soaking method is there's a lot of trim. I will not eat the discolored meat that was touching the water. I don't care what people say, if it's just oxidation or just this or just that, and then it's totally fine. I'm not gonna do that. I'm always gonna trim that away, just as if I had dry aged my meat and was trimming everything that hardened away. So that's the only downside. But with how much better this one tastes, I need to experiment more. Yeah, it's instantly so enjoyable. Whereas this one is like, when you take the bite, it's like, oh, gamey, but it's deer, you know? Not saying this is no gamey flavor, but significantly less. I'm so shook. Based on this experiment, for my next deer or my next game animal, I will do this again for the back straps, and I will trim away all of the discolored meat to reveal this gem that's hiding underneath, the diamond that is forming underneath all of the yuckiness. Some final considerations I want to point out quickly. Number one, the dry on ice method is not the same thing as dry aging. Dry aging involves a lot of airflow in a very controlled environment when it comes to the humidity and the temperature. Number two, I would not recommend keeping the meat dry on ice for more than 24 to 48 hours. This experiment went longer than that, but as a general rule of thumb, you only want to keep the meat dry on ice in the cooler for as long as you need until you're ready to process for the freezer. Soaking on ice is a little different. I soaked on ice for 3.5 days during this experiment, but I've read and heard of people keeping it in coolers, soaking in the ice for 10 days or more. But that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am absolutely blown away by the results. I feel like in my brain, I judged people that did this so hard. Meanwhile, like, joke's on me. It's way better. So that is it. More experimenting to come, and I'll see you guys in the next one.